Welcome to session 3 of learning the Bootstrap framework for web application user interfaces. This session is actually learning the Bootstrap grid. Um, as an introduction to this module, we're going to talk about what is the Bootstrap grid, the basics of the Bootstrap grid, the Bootstrap grid classes, what the grid looks like in HTML code, and then we're going to test it out in Visual Studio. So the goal of this session, again, is just to sort of learn the basics of the Bootstrap grid. So the grid. Bootstrap prearranges the entire display of a web page in 12 columns, and this is called the grid. If you're a web developer, or if you've learned web development, you probably realize one of the first things you have to go do to sort of set up a user interface, since there's no layout in HTML by default, is you have to go set up a table, right? So if you want, your user interface to have a menu at the top and maybe some content down the left side, and then a big box to actually have your end user content in it, you got to go set all that stuff up in a table, right? So Bootstrap tries to simplify all that by pre-creating a table called a grid. And it's not done with traditional HTML tables. It's actually done with div tags with classes. And so each div tag then is either a row or a column, and the columns are nested inside the rows. And then, you might say, well, I don't need 12 columns all the time. Well, that's true, but 12 is about the most you could get on a web page, and it still kind of be usable. So they went with 12. And then to get fewer, you can group those together. And the cool thing about Bootstrap's grid system is you can choose whether you want it kind of to be small, medium, large, extra small, that sort of thing, to target a specific device size. But Bootstrap's grid system will actually automatically adapt that then to screen size changes, including changing grids from going horizontal across the screen to going vertical down the screen for smaller devices or things that are in landscape, portrait mode, like mobile phones or tablets. So you can see some examples of the Bootstrap grid here. So the first examples here are those with, let me get a pointer here so I can point them out. This first one is, all 12 columns, right? Just in the thing, in the first row. The second row shows that I've combined 2 columns to make 6 equal larger columns. And then the third one is I have 4 equal columns, then 3 equal columns, then 2 equal columns, and 1 equal column. So you can see that if I wanted a menu, for example, at the top of my web page, and then under that I just wanted space for my content, then what I might do is create 2 a grid in Bootstrap with 2 rows, 1 column in each row, and the top row would be for my menu, and then the bottom row would be for my content. Because the rows span increase vertically, the more content you put in them. They're not defined vertically, much like the size in much like a grid in an Excel, right? You can make the rows as high as the height of the row as much as you want to hold as much content as you want. Same thing, same kind of thing. The other thing I might want to do, though, is I might want 1 row for my menu across the top, but then I know I'm going to have, let's say, 6 menu items. So maybe I want to use this, right? So I have menu 1 here in this column, menu 2 here, menu 3 here, menu item 4 here, menu item 5 here, menu item 6 here, right? The other thing that you see a lot is across the top they'll have a menu like this, but then down in the body of the web page, they'll have 1 column over on the left with some additional menu items, and then the rest of the page will be where I put all my content. So the first row I might want is this one, and then the second row I might want is this one, right? And this example shows variations where the columns aren't equal width, right? So you can see here I have in this second row, I have a column that's 6 parts of the grid, and then I have 2 additional columns that are 3 each. So you can see other examples here, but the bottom line is they don't have to be, columns don't have to be equal sizes, they can be different sizes. So just some basics about the grid. So just like I mentioned earlier, everything in Bootstrap must be in a container. So, you know, the outermost piece of a Bootstrap web page body is a container or a container fluid, and then inside of that there must be a minimum of 1 row element. So you must have at least 1 row, right? Otherwise it doesn't make any sense. And then inside the row element you place the column elements. And then inside the column elements, you place your own content, right? So the order goes container, row, columns, and then your content in the columns. So there must be a total of 12 columns, but you can span those or combine them into fewer larger columns. And then when defining a column, the number of available columns of the 12 columns you want to span is what you specify. So if I want to span 3 columns, I specify 3. And we'll show how to do that in just a moment. The other thing is there's no need to create white space between, above, or below the columns, unless you just want, you know, some extra space for something. You might want to create a blank row, but in general, Bootstrap manages the white space automatically. You don't have to create additional columns or rows to create white space so that your content doesn't run together. And then finally, you use, as a developer, you use the standard Bootstrap classes that are already predefined to create the rows and columns in your grid. And again, this is a part of the acceleration or the simplification that Bootstrap provides. There's automatically 12 columns, and then you just, you know, decide how to define those. You don't have to create your own classes. Bootstrap already has the classes available for you. So there are 2 classes that define the basic grid. So the row class that you put on a div, HTML div defines a row, and then the column tag, COL tag, on an HTML div, or column class, sorry, on the HTML div tag defines the column. And then when you define a column, there are some classes that further sort of define this, right? The classes themselves further define this. And so the first part is, you know, column. And then the second part is what size do you want, right? And size is really about targeting. I mentioned that Bootstrap can kind of automatically adjust the size, but it allows you to specify small, medium, extra small, small, medium, and large. So XS, SM, MD, and LG sort of as the target platform. In other words, what's the smallest that you think you're going to get? And then I'll scale up from there. If you know you want to do phones, you might start with XS. If you know that your target platform for your app is a PC, you might start with medium. And mostly what I see, just quite frankly, when I look across it, is either XS or MD. I don't see very many smalls or larges because it'll scale up. But they're there if you want to use them, and you can also combine these things, and so you can make all sorts of structures. My recommendation is not to combine them. If you use medium, stay with medium. If you use small, stay with small. But hey, you can combine them, and it works just fine. And you can experiment and get all sorts of things. As I mentioned before, the number of columns to span to create the fewer or wider columns is also included as a part of the class. So the format then for a class to define a column is COL-XX-##, where XX is the size, that's a 2-digit character for the size, and then ## is a 1 or 2-digit number, 1 to 12, for the number of columns of the grid, the number of columns in the basic grid that you want your column to span. So let's look at let's see what that looks like. So here's what it looks like in HTML code, right? So I have my container, then I have my row, and then I have 1 or more columns. So this first one is I have 1 row and 1 column. So basically I do my container, and then I do div class equals row, and then a single div class equals col dash md dash 12. So remember, it's col dash, and this is going to be medium, dash the number of grid columns, 1 to 12, that I want my column to incorporate. So in this case, I want it to incorporate all 12, so I have a single one row, one column container for my content. So this next one is 1 column, 3 equal rows, right? So the same thing, there's my container, here's my row, and then col dash md dash 4, and I have that 3 times because I want 3 columns, and I want my 3 columns to take up, each to take up 4 grid columns, right? So that would look something like this. And then this one here is 3 unequal columns. So you can see I have col-md-6, so this first one should take up 6 of the grid columns, 6 of the 12 grid columns. Col-md-3, so this one takes up 3, and this one takes up 3. And then one last example is 1 row, 2 unequal columns. So I have 1 row and then md-3, so this one takes up 3 of the default grid columns, and md9, this one takes up 9 of the grid columns. So you notice that these numbers in a single row always equal to 12, and they must equal to 12. If you don't make them equal to 12, strange things will happen in your layout. I'm not saying it won't work and that it won't render, but what renders is, kind of unpredictable is probably the best way to put it. So make sure that all of your columns equal to 12, because remember, the default number of columns is 12. So we're going to jump to Visual Studio and see what this looks like. So let me find my Visual Studio. There it is. So you remember earlier, this is my standard HTML, and up here I've got some meta tags that sort of make this a Bootstrap web page. Pardon me. Make this a Bootstrap web page. Here's my title, and then here's my container, right? And I'm doing container-fluid. In the last one, we'll just take this back to container for now. So the first thing I want to do then is create a row, right? And so I'm just going to paste it in here to save time. But here's what I want to do to paste it in that row. So what I've got here then is inside my container, I put another div tag, standard HTML div, and with a class row, right? So now I have a container that just has 1 row in it. Well, remember, by default, there's 12 columns there. So I've got to create a series of columns that add up to 12. So what I want to do, again, I'm just going to kind of paste it in here to save some time, is I'm going to create 12 columns, right? So col-md, so here's the divs with the class col-md-1. And there's the closing div tag, and between that I just have, the number 1 in text. So essentially what I have here is 12 columns where each column takes up 1 column in the Bootstrap grid. So let's see what this looks like. I'll save it, and I will tell Visual Studio to put it in there. And so there we go. You'll notice when it first came up, it was vertical, and the reason it was vertical is because my screen wasn't wide enough. And so that's an example of Bootstrap building out, adapting the grid to work with my screen size. So see, I have a small screen here, so maybe this is a tablet. So it realizes, hey, I can't get 12 columns across this thing in a readable way. They'll start to squish together, right? And so so it's going to make them vertical. If, on the other hand, let's just do a quick find and replace here. Edit. Excuse me, find and replace, quick replace, and I want to find MD and replace it with XS, and we'll replace all. So there we go. I'm going to save that, and I'm going to refresh my browser. And notice now, because I targeted this thing at an extra small screen, it realizes, this thing is going to be on a small screen anyway. If the developer tells me it wants 12 columns on a small screen, they're going to be sort of narrow, but the developer expects them to be narrow. So I will give more, so Bootstrap will give more, leeway in how wide the columns can be. Because again, you told it because I want my columns to be extra small, the width of the column to be extra small. So you know that as a developer. So Bootstrap's saying, okay, well, if you want them extra small, I'll make them extra small and I can get more on a screen. But still, right, as I make these things smaller and get it below the size, right, down to probably there's probably the size of a mobile phone, right, and then after that it starts putting them below it and trying to adapt it and get even smaller, right? So this would maybe be iPhone 5S or one of those really small phones, and you can see that Bootstrap basically said, hey, okay, this is probably too small if I try to get them any smaller, so I'm going to drop them down. So this is Bootstrap being responsive. So I'm going to go and undo all my changes. Put those back up, medium. Back over here, do a refresh, and there we go. And you can see that, hey, Bootstrap is sort of trying to figure out what we want it to do there as the screen size gets smaller. Because remember, I told Bootstrap that I want to target this at a medium-sized screen. So it's unlikely that my content's going to fit on a smaller screen unless I redo this table altogether, this grid altogether, and make my columns go vertical instead of horizontal. So that's, Bootstrap doing what it can to help us out and all of that. So what I want to do now is let's create some additional rows. So again, I'm going to just paste some content in here. There's the ending div tag on my row. So there we go. So now what I've done is I've added one more column, one more row, and here I've said I want my column to take up 12 of Bootstrap's grid columns. So let's hit save, and let's go back to my web page here and hit refresh. I said refresh. Oh, I forgot to put the actual content. And there we go, right? So it's just one. The reason that it's over on the left is it's left justifying the text because I didn't tell it text-center. I hate to do this, text-center. It's a complete Bootstrap class we haven't gone over with, but just to make the demo easy, you can see that now my text is in the center, so I just have one column here, right? So there you go. Let's do just one more of these things. Oops. Cut out over here. This is one you see a lot. This is when you want a left menu on your screen and then the right part of the content, right? So I take a row and I create it into two columns. The first one takes up 3 of the Bootstrap grid columns, the second one 9. I'm going to go ahead and add the text equals center in here so that you can kind of see where the text lines up. Just to get a sense of what it looks like. We'll go through the text in a center in a feature module. But you can see, got content in there again. The number 1 and then the number 2. Or we could just say menu. About that. That'll let us see what it looks like. Refresh, and there you go, right? So over here, centered in these 3 columns, I have the word menu, and then over here, centered in columns 4 through 12, are these 9 columns, I have the word content. And so you can see where, my menu could be over here, my content over here. And you say, well, my menu, I don't want it to be that large, right? That's going to be from somewhere along here over here. That's way too large. Well, okay, if I want to adjust it, I go 2 and then 10. And then I hit save again and refresh, and there you go, right? So see, now my menu is centered only in column 1 and 2, and the content's centered in column 3 through 12, so 2 and 10. And so, you can see it's really easy to adjust. The grid makes it super fast to get your get your layout how you want it versus creating your own tables and pure HTML and all that. It makes it super simple. As we go forward and see how to put panels and things in here, you'll see why this gets even more powerful. So I'm going to stop this and go back to the PowerPoint. So our quiz ended up, what two classes define the basic grid? So that's of course the row column and the row class and the column class. That defines the basic grid. And then, so what's the proper hierarchy for a grid? Is it container, column, row, content, row, column, container, content? And it's not, right? So it's this bottom one. So I have to have my div tag with the container class. Then I have a div class with the row, div tag with the row class. And then I have a div tag with the column class. And then inside of that, I put my content. Back to Visual Studio, just to show again, right? So here's my, there's my HTML body. So that all my stuff has to go in a body. And so here's my div with the container. Here's my div with the row. Here's my div with the column. And then there's my content, right? Here's another row. And, here's my content. So it's always that I have to have, it's container, row, column, and then my content can go in a column. And then how many rows and columns are created by the following code? Of course, and there's only one div tag with the row class, so there's only one row. And then there are 3 div tags with the class column, so there are 3 columns. So to the answers here, the row and the column class, the container, row, column, content, and then, as I said, 1 row and 3 columns by this HTML code here. So that concludes module 3 on the basics of the Bootstrap grid. And as I mentioned earlier, all content goes in the Bootstrap grid. So you sort of, this is key to understanding Bootstrap. You have to think about it in terms of this grid.